And I want to introduce Lincoln Wallen, the CTO of Framestore, for our next presentation. So as Lincoln tells you about new technologies impacting studio and his analysis of the space, when you have questions, you can write them right away. This poll will remain active as Lincoln is giving us his speech. Please welcome Lincoln Wallen, Group Technology Officer at Framestore, past CTO of DreamWorks, of Electronic Arts, of so many other companies. Lincoln.
Thank you, David. I think I'm the fall guy here. David set me up to do this, and I think the purpose was to be somewhat opinionated so that you have something to talk about later. So I apologize for that. I'm not really as opinionated as I might sound, but this is a performance. So as David said, I'm Lincoln Wallen. I know many of you, not necessarily all of you. Currently Group CTO for Framestore and Company 3. I worked at DreamWorks, Electronic Arts, worked in the software industries, licensing into media markets. But for my sins, I also spent 20 plus years as an academic in artificial intelligence. So worked at many of the leading universities across the world in the previous waves of AI. So I'm going to bring a little bit of that perspective to help us talk about this. Okay, so that's Framestore. I'm skipping the video because you know who Framestore is. One of the things about AI, as with all dark princes, is they just keep coming back. And as I said, this is the third time that artificial intelligence has essentially come out of its deep sort of lair and wandered the earth, disturbing executives and governments and so on and so forth. And, you know, while there are differences this time, because in the previous waves, scientists, academics actually did have the ear of government, and in this wave, it's tech bros and investment houses that basically have the ear of government. So it will go slightly differently. I think the end results will be the same. You will remember, or some of you will remember that are old enough, the 5th generation initiative in Japan. So this was the previous wave, not the first one, but the previous wave. All of these waves have the same characteristic, which is researchers in AI identify a particular aspect of human intelligence, a particular technique. The first one was search, the second one was inference, and the third one is neural networks. Compute power is applied to that technique at an enormous rate, so very large-scale compute, and results are produced, and those results are interesting and surprising. The consequence is that the academic area basically thinks it's making progress towards, you know, modeling human intelligence. The word gets out of academia and the language gets out of academia and then is picked up by industry, government, the media, almost as a given. And we can see all that happening to us today. It's appropriate to remind ourselves that Ronald Reagan introduced the Star Wars program, SDI, appropriate in Disney to mention Star Wars. And a lot of us were involved in basically trying to talk government down from the reliance on these types of techniques for those types of strategic defense uses, mainly to do with the obvious points about capturing context and automatic decisions and all the things that are being discussed right now, although not necessarily that intensely. As I said, we had the era of governments back then. I'm not sure we have the era of governments today. So what this technique leads to is the silicon companies basically get on board and they start designing silicon to accelerate this type of computation. That then leads to the idea that a whole new computing paradigm is upon us. The panic sets in. Businesses are basically warned about the massive disruption that they're going to face, and you wait. And you wait and you wait, because essentially scaling hits a wall. A uniform technique, generally speaking, doesn't solve the complex problems that most businesses have. And what happens is that the approach starts to fragment. Special problems are addressed and focused on. Techniques, architecture diverges and fragments. And very slowly but very effectively, the technique is sort of tamed and inserted into the technologies that are being used and used very effectively within the different domains. And so it's essentially, AI does become incredibly impactful. It does become game-changing, but that process is actually done by the industries that it's supposed to disrupt. So in our industry, it's done by all of you. So in some respects, it's not really and shouldn't be seen as a frightening thing. It should be seen as something to pick up, work with, and work out how to make it useful. I think, obviously, AI is a threat. We've just been through the hype cycle. It's very obvious that we are just about at the top of the hype cycle. We're just coming down the other side. I think, DeepSeek was a completely predictable sort of shot across the bows. It's not the first one. It wasn't the first one. There were many examples of this last year. The media wasn't paying much attention. And I think what we're going into now is just the hard work of actually making this stuff work inside our particular industry and others, working out what techniques work and how to actually organize ourselves to exploit it. So hopefully that's what our conversation will be about later on. Of course, there is a threat, and that threat really, because you're probably having these conversations in your own studios or in your own companies, is that, well, isn't AI, getting close to artificial general intelligence? Are we all going to die? Are all, everybody going to be put out of work? I'm intending to become a banker. I'm not sure what you're going to do. And obviously the sort of multimodal software as a service, generative AI services that have come onto the market, a little bit like a public SIGGRAPH conference. Fantastic demos, fantastic indication of promise, but actually taming that to become really useful is going to take a lot of investment, a lot of time, and a lot of smart thinking to actually make it work. It's not going to be just a matter of months before a director can type in, their description of the movie and out pops an Oscar-winning result. I had a really interesting exchange with Jason Reisig, one of the leading animators at DreamWorks now, teaching at USC. And I asked him, as an animator, are you worried about AI? And I thought his answer was actually pretty insightful. He said, if I thought directors knew what they wanted, then I might worry. I think that is exactly right. As many of us who service the industry know, actually talking through, synthesizing the different skill sets that come to bear to actually take a creative vision, an idea, and make it realizable in practice really takes a village. As I've said, there are very good reasons for Jason actually to be excited when machine learning is seen as the next stage in simplification of very complex processes. The normal processes of automation will out, and the propagation of those solutions through bodies like the one here, whether open source or proprietary, will actually help all of us take advantage of these technologies. But when it's presented as removing the need for creative talent, or the need for design, the need for composition, that's obviously self-serving for some parts of the AI industry, but I think we know that that is not really how it's going to work. But the psychological and investment impacts are actually very real. All of us, depending on where you are in the supply chain, are either facing fear or greed, or both together within the same organization. It is having an effect on decision making. So what I want to very quickly run through is just 4 areas for us to sort of consider as we go through this for the conversation. So first of all, it's copyright. And on this, actually, the US Copyright Office is pretty clear. If a work's traditional elements of authorship are produced by a machine, the work lacks human authorship, and the office will not register it. It's that simple. And those of you that work at studios, that's why your studio executives are concerned about the protection of their own IP. this needs to be approached gently and resolved in order for full imagery to actually be acceptable as a form of IP that can actually then be protected. If we think then about that situation, I think we as a community really do need to think about our language. We can do nothing about the term generative AI. It's out there. It's being used in the way it's being used. And right now it's being used for essentially machine authorship, falling foul of exactly that definition. The machine will do it all. You simply give it an idea, whether by text or whether by a sketch. The composition is done by the machine. In principle, right now, that's not copyrightable. But we also know that we've been using neural networks and machine learning for decades in this industry, and we don't use it this way. We use it in a much more targeted way for elements of our computations, for elements of our images, to improve the automation or efficiency of some of our computational processes. It's extremely powerful. We need a term for that. At Framestore, we use the term directed AI simply as a way of distinguishing it from generative. It's not a great distinction. We all know as technologists that generative techniques are used in directed AI use cases, but we have to start somewhere. So one place to start would be, what term should we use? How can we talk to the industry? How can we talk to the media to distinguish between when we're asking the machine to actually create and when we're using the machine to help us simplify and automate? Of course, there's data. So the next challenge is data, and that also reads onto the copyright issue, or at least the predictability of images. So we're sort of well aware. We all know that some of the AI companies have essentially simply scraped data under the guise of fair use, which for R&D and some purposes may actually be quite legal. But obviously building tools and then selling them back into the very industries out of which that IP came is generally not legal. And I think there was a case just resolved 2 days ago in Delaware for Thomson Reuters, simply making exactly that point. So there's something to be done here, which is about where does the data come from? As an industry, we could do a lot to organize ourselves to ensure that there is a clean flow of properly licensed, properly paid for if necessary, or at least cleanly available data on which some of these technologies can be built. And there are AI companies and technology companies in the room who can contribute to actually helping us do that. And that would clear away some of the barriers that our studio executives actually face in adopting the technology and doing so safely. Nobody really wants to run these risks. What we do at Framestore is we look at the data sets for any given model. I think I have a slide on that. No, let me go back. We look at the data sets for any given model. We identify the source of the licensing. We identify whether they're usable commercially or not, whether they've been licensed or whether they're simply unknown. Wherever they're unknown, or they're not for commercial use, or they haven't been paid for, we remove them and we retrain the model. What's interesting about that process, I'm sure many of you are doing the same, is it's not that expensive. Okay, when you have a targeted problem to attack, it's something that you can actually do within the expenditure that you've already sunk into machines and GPUs within your organization. So it's not enormously expensive if you know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, or you're trying to do everything, as some of these generative services are, then of course you've got some problems because you're trying to cover many, many different types of application. So retraining is something that we are going to have to do as an industry until we can actually organize base models or base data sets on which we can all rely legally. And moving on to software, one of the most sort of significant parts of that retraining is actually looking at some of the some of the challenges. What is it that inhibits these models? Well, one of the obvious points, especially in image generation, if you look at coding, models to help you code are actually trained on the inputs. They're trained on code. They're not trained on input-output pairs. This isn't program inference, which has hard limits to it. It's actually trained on the inputs, that is on code. What do we do in images? We're training on outputs. So it's clear what the next step is. It's to introduce the construction of these images as forms of metadata. We have all that. We have all the CG information. We have all the construction information. We have the algorithms that generate a lot of this image. And combining that with the output images is a much better and more effective training mechanism that we can all do and produce the right sorts of outcomes. When you look at it that way, a model is just a piece of middleware. It is a piece of code and probably should be subject to all the normal code licensing structures and legal structures that we already exploit, from tool vendors, third-party vendors within our market, from visual effects studios licensing to the studios for use within their projects and so on. Data is really just code. We knew this a long time ago, but this is now just emphasizing. Uniform algorithms, code, data as code, the two together as training is just compilation. So we're in the business of building binaries that take inputs and produce outputs. What goes into those binaries matters. It needs to be licensed, needs to be properly sourced. As long as we as an industry operate this way, we can actually get to those Zoomer states where we can exploit AI as aggressively as possible. Now, a lot of this has been sort of explored in the past, 20 years ago or 40 years ago in creative domains. Nothing really has changed apart from the commercial environment in which all of this is happening. So we need to be calm, we need to be careful. Ideally, we can clear collectively the blockages that are stopping studios sort of embracing this technology as aggressively as we think they probably should. There are real blockages, these are real issues, they really do need to be cleaned. Now, the good news for those from NVIDIA here is it certainly means that high floating point operations has gone seriously mainstream. So if you have money to invest in GPU companies, seems like a very good idea. It's going to be quite pervasive across all devices, all applications, in all markets. So hopefully that's given you just a touch on some of the issues. I'll repeat them. Copyright is really important to our customers, to studios. Data provenance is really critical. We have to be, as an industry, in a business of cleaning and ensuring that our supply chains are appropriately licensed, fair payment for fair effort to both the creatives producing images, but also our software vendors. Our software vendors, if they haven't woken up already, they will wake up very quickly to the use of their software for the construction and generation of synthetic data sets. That's a form of compilation. It's a form of reverse engineering. And so ideally, the licensing conditions for software that comes into the industry has conditions that say what you can and can't do in terms of its use for synthetic data. And maybe there's a license fee associated with it, maybe there isn't. That's something for us all to work out. As investors in software, visual effects companies, animation companies, and so on, we have a vested interest also in protecting our software in similar ways. We don't want the outputs from our software being used to reverse engineer that IP. I think, so I'll just conclude by saying I'm actually I forget what she was, the third one down. I'm not a Zoomer. I don't think we should be, throwing all the rules out of consideration. Certainly, our customers, looking at this from a service provider point of view, our customers are not saying that. They're not willing to go to that place right now. Maybe they will in the future, but right now we have to be quite careful. We have to be quite sort of mature, and as software vendors in the room, hardware companies in the room, AI companies in the room, help us to have a clean supply chain, and let's get ahead of this so that we stay at the forefront of technological change. Thanks.